I didn't completely get what you were saying about the science aspect in the beginning.
Whether or not we're assigning too much responsibility to scholars to expect that the Quran should answer everything about science, especially because science is evolving, and as Imam Saleh said, Sharia should also evolve. So it seems like as science is evolving, perhaps our scholars are not evolving with their critical thinking and their open-mindedness to question at the simultaneous time.
So as science is evolving, then religion should also evolve.
Our understanding of the religion should evolve.
Our understanding. So there is a problem with that. I think that people are trying to do that. I think there's a big concern in the Muslim world right now, and I've been seeing it, that with the advent of the internet and the advent of social media, there are people in the Muslim world, across Muslim countries, who are now getting a portal into an outside world that they were never exposed to before. Right, so many of us who were raised in these countries, like I grew up in Saudi Arabia, I knew that I had absolutely no access before the internet to anything that was happening outside except what the government thought was okay for us to know. But now people know, they know about these ideas, especially younger generations, they know. And the Muslim world is losing them. Like the older Muslim generation is concerned that they're losing them. People like Bilal Phillips and people like Zakir Naik have all these videos that they're putting out about how we can debate with atheists and how we need to engage with atheists because we're losing our youth to atheism. Someone else mentioned here earlier today that in 2014, Saudi Arabia declared atheists terrorists. That's because they're responding to something. They feel that they're losing their youth, and they're trying really, really hard to do this reinterpretation. There are many sort of New Age scholars that have come about that are writing new translations of the Quran. There is a feminist translation of the Quran out right now, but ultimately they all hit a wall because there are people who know Arabic. They know and they understand Arabic. There's so many things some things you can reinterpret and sort of cast in a different light, but there are many other things that you just can't get around. And it's a very difficult thing because of the infallibility, divinity, immutability aspect. If the way to do it would be to start questioning the idea, is this infallible, is it divine, or is it just divinely inspired? That might be a better way to go down, but just reinterpreting these texts without the option to change them, if you focus on that, science is going to go way further, because science doesn't have any taboos like that. It's constantly evolving. It thrives on that kind of innovation.
Does anyone else on the panel like to comment on that? I want to talk about losing believers. If we as Muslims or Muslimish or former Muslims have the ability to chime in on what the Quran is saying, since it's, like Majid pointed out, 7.7 billion people and not two of us think the same thing. For Islam, for how laws are made, comes down to two types. Hukm, which is authoritative law, and we know even in science, authoritative law is limiting. And the other is fatwa, which is divine law. And fatwa is based on aql, which is intellect, ijma', which is a consensus, and ijtihad, which is jurisprudence. There we go. So, if we all have, as Muslims, intellect, and we are the consensus, then shouldn't we chime in on what these words mean to come to a collective, since we are the ummah?
Yes, I think we should. That's what we're doing here. I think everybody's chiming in. There's been many different points of view here. Many of them have clashed. We've openly disagreed with each other. And we're sitting here talking and listening to each other. And there are some people who will reinterpret, and they will come and say, and I respect these views, even if I disagree with them, that religion and evolution can be compatible. One of the books that had an early influence on me was Maurice Buchal's Islam and Science. where he talked about exactly that. There are also other views that I have that I think that when you interpret and interpret and interpret, and when anything can mean anything, then everything becomes meaningless. And then there are views about, like what you said in your really, really good presentations about what if everything we know isn't true? What do we believe? What do we know that isn't influenced by some kind of bias or some kind of irrationality? So I think that we are all doing that. We're engaged in that process, and everybody should chime in. Whether religion will survive after that, I don't know.
I just wanted to quickly comment on the question there, and perhaps it was a bit rhetorical about, shouldn't we be the ones who are interpreting and deciding what these things mean? And as Ali mentioned, yes, we're doing that sort of process now. People are doing that. But in that question, I see a sort of a hidden assumption or presupposition that somehow these things are with us forever, we're stuck with them, and we might as well just make the best of it and then maybe recreate what they mean to us. And I think we have to step back from that question and say, well, why are we even going through the process of, well, maybe it means this to us or maybe it means that to us. If we fundamentally determine that it's not even true, then maybe we just start over. And related to that is, I've lost my train of thought, so I'll leave it there.
Thank you for that comment. Not necessarily an assumption that we're stuck with it. If instead we do look at it as myths, we know that there are stories in the Quran that have preceded the Quran. I've got a list that's mile long. I mean, we talk about Mithra, the sun god of virgin birth.
Right.
Born December 25th, that's 3,500 years before Christ, and that's the story of Christ.
Right.
We have Noah's Ark that was in the Indian, Sumerian, Babylonian, Egypt, those stories, Mexican even, those stories showed up throughout history, throughout land. So right. These are human stories. So
I got you now, and I remember what I was going to say. Yeah, in that regard, we see that we have a need for a lot of these narratives. And I think one of the challenges, and one of the reasons that question comes up, is because in trying to reinterpret or reflect on and deciding what these things mean to us, we're implicitly coming up against guardians of these texts and traditions who are saying, no, we're not even allowing you to think of it as myth. This is true. And until those forces are there, they're blocking us from having a clean run at making it whatever actually serves us without any of these constraints. So I think the best thing to do is recognize, as you've mentioned, that a lot of these narratives, the stories, the values, the parables, they go back further than the Quran, further than Islam. There is value in those things. And now, instead of limiting ourselves to something that is based in Islam, I myself, in my video, talk about this. We need to start with a clean canvas and bring over the things that actually make sense, the nice narratives that make sense, and we can make up stories that serve us and just say they're fiction. We do that with children. The boy who cried wolf. It's not like there's some historical incident, but we recognize that fictional story served a purpose for teaching certain lessons to our children. There can be fictional stories that serve us as adults, and we acknowledge their fiction. And this is where I think we get past the limiting ourselves to the edifice of Islam as somehow rooted in some kind of divine truth. It can be truth because it speaks to the human spirit, the human story, recurring narratives over and over and over again. But we don't need to limit ourselves to Islam.
Thank you. So that's why I asked the question to the panelists and to the audience here, whether or not we are the ones who decide as the collective, as the intellect, on what Islam means. So who are the guardians of the faith? Is it not the Muslim? Is it not every single one of us? Why is some arbitrary, random group of people deciding what I believe? Why should I make new stories? These are stories old as time. These are the oldest stories in existence. They teach us lessons. Why do I have to throw away those lessons to believe in science? The two can exist. If I take things for what they are, if I say, hey, this is what the purpose of this story is, not, oh, there was actually a guy in this time and something happened. I don't necessarily have to say that I don't have to pick it apart. I can understand why that story is there, why it was told to the Muslims.
I think what you're saying is like a rhetorical question. That's actually a great point. So I would just say I agree with you. That's
Majid,
it. I don't have the
did you want to add something?
So there's a danger in absolutist and superior thought process. So yes, the religions all have benefit. Yes, we can look at these stories. But what we fail to look at are the side effects. You know, when you prescribe a drug, right? You watch a drug commercial and they go for 5 minutes telling you all the side effects. Well, when you have absolutist belief, what are we having? World wars, civil wars, genocides, oppression, abuse. You can go on. That's the side effect. But we ignore that because my religion is superior, my belief is superior, my religion is divine. And we ignore all the side effects because somehow it's doing good. It's lowering my cholesterol. It's making me comfortable. But the end result is there is a side effect that's affecting other people around us.
Wissam? I'm going to take a question from the audience, a couple of them.
I actually have a few questions, but I won't ask one for now, till I have more time. So the question is, Dr. Stockton, the teaching of the theory of evolution, do you feel that although the case has decided in defense of teaching evolution in classroom, that yet the implementation of this practice has somehow been suppressed in practice? Like in actual schools, the theory of evolution is kind of taught with choice for the students whether to accept it or not. There is always focus on the satisfaction of their parents. What's your input now, years after that case, on the actual practice of teaching the theory of evolution in class, regardless of the bias of the parents?
The issue today is fairness and equal treatment. That's the argument that's made today, that you should be allowed to teach evolution along with creationism, that these are two interpretations of where humanity emerged. And the courts have consistently struck those down because they say creationism is a religious doctrine. We interpret the Constitution, which does not have religious principles in it. So that's that issue. I think if I were teaching a high school class and wanted to deal with this topic, I don't deal with it, but it's not in my field. But if I did, I think I would say, I would present some of these arguments about survival and selection, which everybody can agree on, that certain superbugs exist that didn't exist 50 years ago, and they're impervious of penicillin, or human beings have gotten 6 inches taller over the last 1,000 years. You could point those things out, nobody would disagree with you. I would say, I think there's a different interpretation of instantaneous creation by divine force. That's not something we're going to do, but I'm just going to say it's out there, and if you want to consider that, you can do that, but I'm not allowed to do that in this class. I think you have to be respectful of people, and I think very often we're not respectful of people, and that was the thrust of my talk. That if you're not respectful of people, you're going to get a political backlash, which is going to become explosive, and it's going to manifest itself in terms of people voting for people who are, not mainstream. And so I think many times the people who are advocates of scientific thinking create their own problems in the political arena by not respecting the complexity of how people believe. And I want to make a point because I'm from the Christian tradition, so I know that more, and I'm not saying anything about the Islamic tradition because I don't know it. But there's a term called hermeneutic, which means a way you extract a meaning out of a text. And in the Protestant tradition, Catholics are in a separate category, there are really two main ways of looking at things. From the mainstream Protestant, Presbyterians, Methodists, whatever, they say God's truth is in the Bible, but it has to be extracted by human beings. The words should not be treated as literal stories. Evangelicals will say we treat the Bible in a different way, but people say evangelicals have a literalist interpretation of the text. That is not true. There's a passage in the Bible about the valley of dry bones. Someone is coming and he sees a valley where it's a burial site and there are bones all around, and suddenly the bones start moving and they link together and the sinews grow back and the muscles grow back and the blood starts flowing and they dance. There's not a single minister in all of North America who has ever said that's a literal story. Nobody really thinks dead bones are. It's a story that no matter how low you are, you can be revived by faith in God. That's a story. It's not literal. So to say that evangelicals or fundamentalists or whatever believe in the literal interpretation of the text, it's simply not true. What they do believe is that the truth of God is in the text, and they believe that on certain types of issues, like the creation story, the Bible is very specific. God created humans separate on a separate day, in a separate way from all the other creatures, and breathed breath into them. So each of us has divine breath. We have a spark of divine inside of us. That seems to me leaving aside the science of it, that seems to me a very reassuring thing, that each person has a piece of God inside of us. The Spirit of God is in us. So if we kill another person, we're killing God. That's what we're doing. And so, in fact, some of these metaphors of killing God, they became very prominent in discussing the Holocaust. That, God was killed in Auschwitz. Okay, God wasn't killed in Auschwitz, but in a sense, God was killed in Auschwitz. So I think I think we shouldn't be just simplistic about this. I think it's complex. I'll leave the Muslim debate to those of you who are Muslims. But those of us on the Christian side, it's a complex debate, and we have different ways of interpretation, at least two major means of interpretation. Both are accepted as being fully compatible within the Christian faith and within the Christian text.
Thank you, Professor Stockton. I'm going to take a question from
Thank you. That's to Mr. Ali, of course, Dr. Ali. First, I'd like to thank you for correcting me about evolution being beautiful. What I meant in it is the understanding and seeing how evolution works. It is beautiful seeing how it is, but yeah, from a species going through evolution, that's a painful process, of course, for any species. And thanks for correcting me anyway. I agree that I was wrong by saying it this way. My question is, I noticed that all the speakers, including you, accused religion of what people are doing, people of religion are doing. And I think we should separate between the two. Whatever Muslims are doing, it's not necessarily Islam. And there's a big misunderstanding in it. For example, if I take the sterilization of women in the United States back in the 20s and 30s based on the science of evolution, or if we take the protection of the Aryan race that caused the World War II, caused 70 million people to die, do I say science is wrong? Do I deny science, or do I deny those actions by those people and keep science out of that? That's one thing. And definitely there's a big misunderstanding. You just mentioned beat up your wife. It's not in the Holy Quran to beat up anybody, including wife. This is big misunderstanding, misinterpretation of the verse, and as a result, mistranslation. But this is, I guess, I have the subject now. My question is, You put in faith and science at the same basket. Science, yes, has to prove things. I expect proof for any scientific claim. But faith is when you cannot prove scientifically, that's when you have faith, either you accept it or you do not accept it. If you can reject it, then I stand with you. But if you cannot reject it, then I have a right to have that faith. And
Yeah, I think you absolutely have the right to have that faith. But what I'm talking about, there's a difference between respecting people's, this kind of goes to the evolution thing we're talking about. There's a difference between respecting the right of people to have faith, which we all should respect, versus respecting what the beliefs are themselves. So there's this sort of general idea nowadays that we need to respect each other's beliefs, we need to respect each other's beliefs. But there are a lot of really crazy beliefs that people have. I mean, being colloquial here, but there are people who believe that the Holocaust didn't happen. There are people who believe that little girls should be circumcised. There are many people who believe terrible things. And do they have the right to believe them? I think that they do. I believe in the right that people have to believe in these things. I don't think that we need to respect the beliefs themselves. We have to respect people's rights to have those beliefs. So, and that's where we're having the discussion. As for what you said about evolution being beautiful, I have to say I agree with you. I think seeing how evolution works is